The children made no sound when they were discovered. That silence was what unsettled Dr. Samuel Hendris the most as he descended the rickety wooden stairs. On March 17, 1842, 23 pairs of eyes watched him from the shadows of the basement beneath the Clearwater estate, yet not a single child cried out. No whimper, no gasp, only a suffocating stillness, thick as the dust that swirled in the dim light of his lantern. Samuel had served as the family physician in Marietta, Georgia for 11 years. He had delivered breech babies, set broken bones, and closed the eyes of the dying. He thought he had witnessed everything a man of medicine might encounter in the South, but standing there, surrounded by faces that seemed more ghostly than human, he realized some horrors exist beyond the comprehension of decent men. The discovery had come by accident, as most terrible truths do. It had begun 3 days earlier, when Margaret Clearwater, the elderly aunt of the estate's owner, collapsed during Sunday service at the Presbyterian church. Samuel had been called to examine her. Though he initially suspected a common apoplexy, something about her condition troubled him. She kept repeating the same phrase over and over, "They're waiting below, they're still waiting." Her nephew, Thomas Clearwater, dismissed it as the ramblings of an old, confused mind. "She's been speaking nonsense for weeks, Doctor," he said, "ever since she fell down the cellar stairs and hit her head." Yet Margaret's eyes were unnervingly clear when she gripped Samuel's wrist with surprising strength. "The children," she gasped. "Someone must tell about the children." Samuel promised he would return the next day to check on her. But Margaret died that very night, suddenly and without explanation. Her body was discovered by the housemaid the following morning. Dawn, cold in her bed, her face frozen in an expression that the maid would later describe as terrified beyond recognition. The funeral was arranged quickly, too quickly, some of the town gossips whispered. But the Clearwaters were influential people, plantation owners with ties to half the prominent families in Cobb County. Nobody questioned their decisions openly except Dr. Samuel Hendris. He couldn't shake Margaret's final words. That evening, as he sat in his small office reviewing his medical notes, he found himself thinking about the Clearwater estate. The family had owned that property for nearly 40 years, since Thomas's grandfather had built it in 1803. It was one of the largest plantations in the area, with nearly 200 acres of farmland and dozens of workers tending the fields. But there was something about that house that had always unsettled him. The way it sat back from the main road surrounded by dense woods, the heavy curtains that were always drawn across the windows, the strange, almost oppressive silence that seemed to blanket the property whenever he visited. And now Margaret's cryptic warning about children. Samuel made a decision that he would question for the rest of his life. On March 16th, under the pretense of retrieving a medical instrument he claimed to have left behind during his visit, he returned to the Clearwater estate. Thomas was away in Atlanta on business. The household staff consisted of an elderly groundskeeper and 2 housemaids who were occupied with their duties on the upper floors. He told himself he was simply checking the cellar where Margaret had allegedly fallen, looking for hazards that might have caused her injury, a professional courtesy to prevent future accidents. But Samuel Hendris knew he was lying to himself. The cellar entrance was located off the kitchen behind a door that looked like it led to a storage pantry. The stairs descended into darkness, and the air that rose from below was stale and heavy with an odor he couldn't quite identify, something musty and organic, like old cloth and unwashed bodies. His lantern illuminated wooden steps worn smooth by years of use. As he descended, he noticed scratch marks along the walls, small handprints in the dust. His heart began to beat faster. The cellar was larger than he expected, extending beneath the entire eastern wing of the house. Wooden support beams divided the space into sections. Old furniture, trunks, and agricultural equipment crowded the shadows. But as Samuel moved deeper into the space, his lantern revealed something that made his blood turn cold. A wall. It shouldn't have been there. The basement's dimensions didn't match the house's footprint. This wall was newer than the others, constructed from different wood, and there was a door secured with 3 heavy iron locks. Samuel's hands shook as he examined the locks. They were well-oiled, recently used. Fresh scratches marked the wood around the doorframe, as if something or someone had clawed at it from the other side. He should have left. He should have walked up those stairs and reported his findings to the county sheriff. But the memo. Eye of Margaret Clearwater's terrified eyes drove him forward. Using a crowbar he found among the cellar tools, he pried at the locks until they gave way with a screech of protesting metal. The door swung inward, and that's when Samuel Hendris found the children, 23 of them, ranging from perhaps 4 years old to early adolescence. They sat on the dirt floor of a hidden chamber, their backs against the walls, staring at him with eyes that reflected his lantern light like animals caught in the dark. They wore simple, identical grey clothing. Their hair was cut short, boys and girls alike. Their skin was pale, unnaturally pale for a Georgia spring, as if they hadn't seen sunlight in years. "My God," Samuel whispered. None of the children moved. None of them spoke. They simply watched him, their expressions blank and unreadable. He took a step forward, and that's when he noticed the chains. Each child wore a thin metal band around one ankle connected to a long chain bolted to the stone foundation. The chains were long enough to allow movement within the chamber, but not long enough to reach the door. Old blankets were piled in the corners. A bucket in the far wall served purposes he didn't want to imagine, and along one side of the room sat rows of books, primers, readers, arithmetic texts, all neatly arranged as if this underground prison was some sort of twisted schoolroom. "Can you speak?" Samuel asked, his voice cracking. "Do you understand me?" A girl near the front, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she made a series of hand gestures, precise and deliberate, her fingers forming shapes in the air. Samuel's stomach lurched. These children had been taught not to speak, or perhaps they had been silent for so long they had forgotten how. He moved from child to child, checking their pulses, looking into their eyes, examining them with the clinical detachment his training demanded, even as his mind reeled with horror. They were malnourished, but not starving. They showed signs of minimal medical care, old scars properly healed, no obvious infections. Someone had been keeping them alive, maintaining them like livestock. But why and for how long? As Samuel completed his examination of the last child, a small boy with eyes that seemed too large for his face, he heard footsteps on the cellar stairs above. Heavy footsteps moving quickly. Someone was coming. Thomas Clearwater stood at the top of the stairs, blocking the only exit, his face and expressionless mask in the dim light filtering from the kitchen. "Dr. Riss," he said calmly, as if they had encountered each other at a social gathering. "I wasn't expecting you." Samuel's mind raced. He was trapped in a basement with evidence of a crime so horrific he could barely comprehend it, and the man responsible stood between him and freedom. His medical bag felt absurdly heavy in his hand. "Thomas, I can explain." "No need." Thomas descended 3 steps, enough to see into the hidden chamber. His eyes swept over the children without emotion. "You found my aunt's project. I suppose I should have anticipated this." Margaret always was careless with her words, especially toward the end. "Your aunt's project?" Samuel's voice rose despite his effort to remain calm. "Thomas, there are children chained in your basement." "This is complicated," Thomas finished. "Yes, very complicated. Which is why I'm going to ask you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, Samuel. Your life depends on your understanding." Samuel's hand tightened around his medical bag. Inside were instruments, a scalpel, forceps, tools that could serve as weapons if needed. But Thomas was younger, stronger, and positioned above him on the stairs. Any attempt at violence would be suicide. "I'm listening," Samuel said. Thomas sat down on the steps, his posture relaxed despite the grotesque circumstances. "My aunt began this work 23 years ago, 1819. You wouldn't remember, but that year there was a fever that swept through the county, killed dozens, mostly the children of field workers and house staff. My grandfather, he owned this estate then, and he was troubled by the losses, not for moral reasons, you understand, for financial ones. Samuel felt sick. He was worried about the loss of future workers. Precisely. The infant mortality rate among the workforce was interfering with the plantation's long-term productivity. My grandfather had read about orphanages in Europe, institutions that raised children in controlled environments. He wondered if similar principles could be applied here in a more efficient manner. "This is madness. This is business," Thomas corrected. My Aunt Margaret, she had a mind for organization. She proposed an experiment. Take the youngest children, the orphans, and those whose mothers couldn't care for them properly, and raise them in isolation. No exposure to disease from the fields, no corrupting influences, controlled diet, controlled environment, basic education to make them more valuable workers. A laboratory, if you will, for creating the perfect labor force. Samuel's hands trembled with rage. These are human beings, Thomas. Children, are they? Thomas's question hung in the air like a challenge. Look at them, Doctor. Really look. Do they seem human to you anymore? Against his will, Samuel glanced back at the children. They still sat in perfect silence, watching the conversation with those unsettling animal-like eyes. No fear, no hope, just passive observation. The first group, they were infants when they went below, Thomas continued. Margaret raised them in complete darkness for the first year, then gradually introduced limited lamplight. She fed them on precise schedules, taught them to communicate through gestures rather than speech. Sound carries, you understand? And we couldn't risk visitors hearing children's voices from beneath the house. She created a routine, a structure, and they adapted. Children are remarkably adaptable creatures. She destroyed them, Samuel whispered. She shaped them. Thomas insisted every few years as they matured, Margaret would bring them up to work the fields at night, when no visitors might see them. They were obedient, efficient, never complained because they literally didn't know complaint was possible. The experiment was, by all measures, a success. Then why are they still down here, if your family was using them as workers? Because Margaret became attached, Thomas said, and for the first time emotion crept into his voice. Irritation. She spent more time with these children than with her own family. She educated them beyond what was necessary, taught them to read, to calculate, to think. She gave them books and paper and encouraged their curiosity. By the time I inherited the estate 5 years ago, they had become more liability than asset. They knew too much. They had developed opinions. Samuel's mind reeled. You mean they became human? I mean they became dangerous. So I ordered Margaret to cease the experiment. I plan to relocate them to the Western Territories, find positions for them in frontier towns where nobody would ask questions about pale, uneducated workers appearing from nowhere. But Margaret refused. She said they were her life's work. She said she loved them like her own children. Thomas laughed bitterly. Can you imagine loving something you created to be a tool? What did you do? Samuel already knew the answer. The terror in Margaret's dying eyes, the convenient fall down the cellar stairs. I reminded her where her loyalty should lie, Thomas said quietly. Family loyalty, blood loyalty, and when she threatened to expose the entire operation to the authorities, I made a difficult decision for the good of the family name, for the preservation of our reputation and fortune. You killed her. I protected my inheritance. There's a difference, Thomas stood, brushing dust from his trousers. Which brings us to our current dilemma, Dr. Hicks. You now possess knowledge that could destroy everything my family has built. The question is, what do we do about that? Samuel felt the weight of 23 pairs of eyes watching him. These children, these victims of a decadazzle-long atrocity, sat in silence as two men discussed their fate like agricultural property. The horror of their situation had become so normalized that they didn't even react to the revelation that their caretaker had been murdered. Let them go, Samuel heard himself say. Release these. Why exist? And I have absolutely no moral compulsion to improve their situation. Your death won't save them, Samuel. It will only add another body to a family plot that's already crowded with secrets. Samuel Hicks didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk, staring at his medical books as if they might contain some guidance for the moral catastrophe he had stumbled into. The faces of those 23 children haunted him. Their silence, their blank expressions, the absolute absence of childhood that should have filled their eyes with wonder or fear or any human emotion at all. Thomas had given him until the following evening to provide his answer. Accept the bargain and live with the knowledge of what festered beneath the Clearwater estate, or refuse, and face consequences that would likely leave him as dead as Margaret, with the children no better off than before. But there was a third option, one that Thomas hadn't considered because men like him never believed that people like Samuel would have the courage to act. He could expose everything. Samuel pulled paper toward him and began to write. Not a report for the sheriff. Thomas was right that local authorities might be reluctant to investigate a prominent family without overwhelming evidence, but Samuel knew people in Atlanta, reformers and abolitionists, who worked through networks that operated outside official channels, people who understood that sometimes justice required circumventing legal systems designed to protect the powerful. He wrote 3 letters that night. The first to a newspaper editor in Atlanta who had published exposés about plantation abuses. The second to a Methodist minister involved in underground movements that helped enslaved people escape to free states. The third to a lawyer who had defended accused runaways and had connections with northern anti-slavery societies. In each letter, he detailed everything he had seen: the hidden chamber, the chained children, Thomas's confession about his aunt's experiment, and the murder implied by Margaret's suspicious death. He included a map showing the cellar's location and descriptions detailed enough that authorities would have to investigate even if he disappeared. As dawn broke over Marietta, Samuel sealed the letters and paid a traveling merchant to post them from 3 different towns, ensuring that even if one was intercepted, the others would reach their destinations. Then he returned to the Clearwater estate to buy time. Thomas received him in the main house's parlor, a room decorated with expensive furniture and portraits of stern-faced Clearwater ancestors, who seemed to judge Samuel from their gilded frames. "Have you reached a decision, Doctor?" Thomas asked, pouring himself a brandy despite the early hour. "I want to see them again," Samuel said. "The children. Before I agree to anything, I need to examine them properly, document their health. If I'm to be complicit in this situation, I need to know they're not in immediate physical danger." It was a gamble. If Thomas refused, it would confirm that the children's condition was worse than Samuel had observed in his brief first encounter. But if he agreed, it would give Samuel time to begin planning an actual rescue, rather than simply exposing the crime and hoping others would act. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. But understand, Doctor, I'm allowing this because I believe you're intelligent enough to recognize an unwinnable situation when you see it. Don't mistake my cooperation for weakness." They descended to the hidden chamber together. In daylight, or what passed for daylight through the cellar's high windows, the horror of the space seemed even more pronounced. Samuel could see details he'd missed in the lamplight, marks on the walls where small hands had scratched away years of boredom or despair, a calendar someone had carved into the stone foundation with tick marks counting days that blurred into months into years, textbooks whose pages were worn thin from repeated reading because there was nothing else to do in the endless darkness. The children were awake, sitting in the same positions as before. Samuel wondered if they ever moved of their own volition, or if Margaret's training had made them so passive that they simply waited for instructions like wind-up toys whose mechanisms had run down. He began his examinations systematically, checking each child for signs of disease, malnutrition, or injury. Most were in surprisingly decent physical health. Margaret had clearly understood that sick children would be liabilities, but their psychological state was another matter entirely. They responded to direct commands, but showed no initiative. They ate food when offered, but didn't ask for it. They allowed Samuel to examine them without resistance, but also without the normal apprehension children displayed around doctors. They were, in every sense that mattered, broken. As he worked, Samuel spoke to them gently, trying to provoke any response, any flicker of personality. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked each one. "Do you remember your parents? Do you know how long you've been here?" Nothing. Just those empty stares and occasionally those strange hand gestures that represented the only language they'd been permitted to develop. But with the 11th child, a girl who appeared to be about 9 years old, something different happened. When Samuel asked if she could write, she nodded slightly. He provided paper and pencil from his medical bag, and she began to draw, not words but pictures, simple childlike images that told a story, a woman's face rendered with careful detail. Margaret Samuel realized a series of figures, each smaller than the last, the children at different ages, and then most disturbingly a sequence showing the woman's face changing. First kind, then worried, then frightened, then blank. The girl looked up at Samuel, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes. Not quite emotion, but the ghost of it. A recognition that something had been lost. "You knew something was wrong with her," Samuel whispered with Margaret. "You saw her changing." The girl made a gesture, hands together, then pulling apart. "Separation. She was being separated from you. Someone was keeping her away." The girl pointed upward toward the main house. Then she made a chopping motion with her hand, sharp and final. Samuel's blood ran cold. These children had understood what was happening. In their silent way, they had witnessed Margaret's descent into fear, her increasing desperation, and probably even suspected the truth about her death. But they had no way to communicate it, no ability to seek help or protect themselves. They were witnesses to their own tragedy, trapped not just by chains, but by the very muteness that had been inflicted upon them as infants. Dr. Thomas's voice came from the doorway, sharp with warning. "You're taking rather long with your examination." Samuel stood, his mind racing. These children need sunlight. Their bones are weakening from the lack of vitamin D. At minimum, they require exposure to natural light for several hours each day, or they'll develop serious health problems. "Interesting," Thomas said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "And how would you propose I accomplish this without someone noticing 23 mysteriously pale children emerging from my cellar?" "Night air." Samuel improvised. Moonlight provides enough ambient light to help. Samuel and Hayes had spent 2 frantic days creating a cover story. They would stage evidence suggesting the children had been taken by slave traffickers operating out of Tennessee. A false trail of clues, a dropped kerchief with a Memphis merchant's mark, horseshoe tracks leading north, a witness who would claim to have seen suspicious strangers near the Clearwater property. It was crude, but in the chaos following the discovery, it might buy enough time to get the children safely away before anyone realized the truth. The network had arranged safe houses along a route that would take the children north through Tennessee, Kentucky, and eventually into Ohio and free territory. It would take weeks, moving slowly to avoid attention. Each child would be given a new identity, documents claiming they were orphans being relocated to religious institutions. Some might find families willing to adopt them. Others would go to actual orphanages, legitimate O.N.E.S., where they would at least have a chance at something resembling normal lives. It was an imperfect solution to an impossible situation, but it was the best Samuel could offer. On the evening of March 21st, he dressed carefully in his most professional attire, checked his medical bag, and tried to calm the trembling in his hands. He had never broken a serious law in his life. He had always been a man who believed in systems and proper procedures. But sometimes systems were designed to protect monsters, and procedures existed to perpetuate injustice. He arrived at the Clearwater estate at precisely 7:30 p.m. The groundskeeper barely glanced at him. Samuel had visited frequently enough that his presence raised no suspicion. He let himself in through the side entrance, carrying his medical bag and a package supposedly containing medicine. The house was quiet. Samuel could hear one of the housemaids singing softly in the kitchen. He moved quickly to the cellar door, unlocked it with the key Thomas had given him during their arrangement, and descended into darkness. His hands shook as he lit the lamp and approached the hidden chamber. The locks had already been left open. Thomas's confidence that Samuel was now complicit had made him careless. Samuel pulled the door wide and faced the children. They looked at him with those same empty expressions, waiting for instructions, but Bright Eyes was different. She stood immediately, her posture alert in a way Samuel hadn't seen before. She had understood something was about to happen. "Listen carefully," Samuel whispered, knowing they would hear him even though they couldn't respond. "I'm getting you out of here, all of you, Tony. But you must do exactly as I say, and you must remain completely silent. Do you understand?" 23 heads nodded in unison. Samuel began removing their ankle chains using tools he'd brought for this purpose. The bolts were old, and he had to work quickly. Every minute increased the risk of discovery. As each child was freed, Bright Eyes organized them into a line, using those silent hand gestures to communicate instructions. The efficiency was heartbreaking. These children had been trained to obey so thoroughly, that even their liberation was executed with mechanical precision. It took 20 minutes to free all of them. Samuel's arms ached from the effort, and sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cellar's chill. As he worked on the final chain, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Footsteps above, heavy ones. Thomas had returned early. "Stay here," Samuel hissed to the children. "Stay absolutely silent." He rushed up the cellar stairs, closing the door behind him, just as Thomas appeared in the hallway. His face was flushed with anger. "What are you doing here?" Thomas demanded. "I thought you weren't coming until tomorrow." Samuel's mind raced. "The child I examined, her condition worsened. I couldn't wait. I brought medicine." At night, without sending word, Aunt Thomas's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You're lying, Doctor. The question is, what are you lying about?" Samuel saw Thomas's gaze move toward the cellar door. In his haste, he had left it slightly ajar. Everything happened in seconds. Thomas lunged for the door. Samuel grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back. They struggled, crashing against the wall. Thomas was younger and stronger, but Samuel fought wit. The desperation of a man who knew that failure meant death for 23 children. "What have you done?" Thomas snarled, breaking free and throwing open the cellar door. "What have you done?" He thundered down the stairs. Samuel followed, knowing that everything was about to fall apart. Thomas reached the hidden chamber and saw the freed children standing in their line, chainless, organized for escape. His face contorted with rage. "You fool, you absolute fool. Do you have any idea what you've—" He never finished the sentence. Bright eyes. The girl who had spent her entire conscious life in silence and obedience stepped forward and pushed Thomas as hard as she could. He was standing at the top of 3 stone steps that descended into the chamber's lowest section. The push wasn't hard enough to injure him seriously under normal circumstances, but Thomas was off balance, turning to face this unexpected challenge. His foot caught on the edge of the step. He fell backward, arms windmilling, and his head struck the stone foundation with a sickening crack. Thomas Clearwater lay motionless, blood pooling beneath his skull. Samuel rushed to check his pulse. Nothing. The fall had killed him instantly. For a moment the chamber was absolutely silent. Then Samuel heard voices from outside. Hayes and his people arriving, calling softly through the darkness. "Down here," Samuel shouted, his voice breaking. "We need help." The next hour was chaos. Hayes and his companions arrived to find a dead man and 23 children who were now witnesses to a killing, however accidental. The plan had been complicated enough when they were only stealing property. Now they were fleeing a death scene, but Hayes, to his credit, didn't hesitate. "We move now. We move fast. Load the children into the wagons. Cover them completely. Dr. Hicks, you stay here." "What?" "No. I'm coming with you." "You can't," Hayes said firmly. "If you disappear the same night Thomas Clearwater dies, you'll be hunted as a murderer. But if you stay, if you're the one who discovers the body and reports it, you become a witness instead of a suspect. You say you came to check on the children, found Thomas dead at the bottom of the stairs and the children gone. You suggest the same traffickers who killed Thomas also took them. It's your only chance." Samuel looked at the children filing silently toward the wagons. Bright eyes met his gaze, and for the first time something like emotion crossed her face. Gratitude, perhaps, or apology, or simply acknowledgement that they had both done what was necessary. "Go," Samuel told Hayes. "Get them somewhere safe." Within 15 minutes the wagons had vanished into the night, carrying their silent cargo toward an uncertain but hopefully better future. Samuel stayed in the cellar, sitting next to Thomas's body, composing the story he would tell. He would say he had arrived for a medical check and heard sounds of struggle from the cellar. He would say he found Thomas at the bottom of the stairs, apparently having fallen while investigating suspicious noises. He would say the children were already gone when he arrived, and he assumed traffickers had broken in and taken them during the confusion. It was weak. It had holes, but in the chaos that would follow the discovery of Thomas's body and the missing children, it might be enough to deflect immediate suspicion, and Samuel's letters, which should be, Ayres saw them as monsters whose sins had finally been exposed. Most people fell somewhere in between, uncomfortable with the implications, but unwilling to fully condemn a respected family without absolute proof. Dr. Lawrence Pritchard fled Marietta the day after the story broke, which many took as confirmation of his involvement. His sudden departure added credibility to Samuel's account. If Pritchard had been guilty of conspiracy, it made sense that his accomplices had targeted the Clearwater estate. Margaret Clearwater's body was exhumed and re-examined, and this time subtle signs of foul play emerged, details the original cursory examination had missed. Evidence suggested her death might not have been accidental after all. This revelation cast a shadow over Thomas Clearwater, making his own mysterious death seem potentially retaliatory. Samuel Hendris continued his medical practice, navigating the uneasy whispers and suspicious glances of some patients, while others offered quiet support, seeing him as a witness to tragedy rather than a participant. He performed the role of the traumatized physician flawlessly, a man carrying the weight of horrors he could barely comprehend, yet striving to serve his community. But in the solitude of night, in his office, his thoughts returned to the children. He had no way of knowing whether they had reached safety. Hayes had promised to relay news through the network, but weeks passed without word. Samuel clung to the silence as a hopeful sign. It meant no one had been caught, no threads traced back, yet uncertainty gnawed at him relentlessly. Then, 6 weeks after the children's liberation, a letter arrived. There was no return. Ad S. The postmark smudged beyond recognition. Inside, a single sheet bore what appeared to be a child's drawing, 23 figures standing in sunlight, arms lifted toward a sky dotted with birds. At the bottom, carefully written in small, painstaking letters, "We learned to speak. Thank you." Samuel burned the letter immediately, eliminating any trace that could link him to the escaped children. But he memorized every detail, the image, the words. They became a talisman against the guilt that haunted him, guilt over the lies he had told about Thomas's death, guilt over his delayed intervention, and guilt over the lives he had tried to protect yet could never fully save. The official investigation concluded in May 1842. The report stated that Thomas Clearwater had died falling while investigating a break-in by traffickers who had stolen property, children of uncertain legal status kept at the estate under circumstances that remained murky. The language was diplomatic and abstract, blaming unseen criminals while sidestepping the harder questions. Why were the children hidden in the first place? The Clearwater estate was sold to satisfy debts and legal claims. Its new owners filled in the cellar chamber, attempting to bury the property's dark history beneath concrete and forgetfulness. Eventually, the house became a boarding school, a grimly ironic turn where the laughter of children finally replaced the suffocating silence of the basement. Samuel Hendris continued practicing medicine in Marietta for 18 more years. He never married, dedicating himself entirely to his work. Known for his compassion, he treated the poorest without ever refusing care and gave special attention to children's health. He never spoke of the basement under the Clearwater estate. Yet at night he would imagine the 23 children living in freedom somewhere, speaking, laughing, feeling sunlight without fear. He pictured them growing up, some perhaps becoming teachers themselves, helping others find their voices. He could never know if his imaginations matched reality. The children had vanished into the networks that had saved them, their anonymity necessary for protection. Their names, experiences, and fates remained unknown, but in his memory the drawing lived on, 23 figures standing in sunlight. It became a small symbol of hope, a quiet reminder that sometimes justice meant letting go, accepting that those you save might live lives you never witness. In the autumn of 1860, as tensions between North and South escalated toward war, Samuel received one final message, a newspaper clipping from an Ohio abolitionist publication, describing a small community of formerly enslaved people who had founded schools and mutual aid networks. The article mentioned children who had once been silenced, now learning to speak and write. There were no names Samuel recognized, no confirmation that these were the Clearwater children. Yet at the bottom of the clipping was a small symbol, an eye, bright and watchful, gazing toward the horizon. Samuel tucked the clipping into his journal and allowed himself to believe that, somewhere, those children had found a measure of freedom. It was not the ending they deserved. No ending could restore what had been stolen, but it was a small light against the darkness humanity could unleash when cruelty was justified. He died in 1865, just weeks after the Civil War ended, witnessing the legal abolition of the system that had made Margaret Clearwater's experiment possible. His final journal entry, dated April 10, 1865, contained only one sentence: "May they all find sunlight." The truth of the Clearwater estate remained buried. Some stories are too dark, too complicated to be reduced to heroes and villains. Samuel Hendris had saved 23 children, yet he had also perpetuated lies to protect his reputation, enabling the network while benefiting from the privileges that allowed him to act. The children themselves, the real witnesses to the tragedy, vanished into anonymity, their voices silent by necessity, their histories preserved only in fragments and whispers. And so the basement, where 23 children had been hidden for years, became legend rather than history. Yet in old parts of Marietta, where the Clearwater estate once stood, some claim they can still feel a presence beneath the buildings that replaced it. The weight of the voices that were never allowed to speak lingers in the foundation, patient and waiting to be acknowledged. The children had learned to speak, the letter claimed, but the place that imprisoned them remained forever silent.